Good morning, everyone. I'm not Andrea Zedel, Daniela Bono from Population Europe, and I'm going to moderate this next session, which will be about international migration. We'll have two speakers for this session, which I'm very honored to present to you. The first to speak today will be Emilio Zagheni. He is the director of the Max Planck for Demographic Research and also associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington. Our second speaker will be Heiner Münz, who is visiting professor at the Central European University. And so I won't use the time. Each of them will take around 15 to 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have a slot for question and answers. So please, if your questions come before they finish the presentation, just type them in the Q&A function in the bottom of the screen, and we'll discuss this afterwards. So Emilio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela. Let me share my screen. Okay, I assume that you can all see it and you can hear me. If not, just stop me. Right, well, thanks again, Daniela, for the introduction. And thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to be part of the Global Demography Forum. Today, I'm going to talk about combining social media and survey methods for migration research. Now, before I get into the substantive part of this talk, I would like to acknowledge collaborators and co-authors who contributed to the work that I'm presenting today. They include a core group of scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Demography Research. They are Daniela Perrotta, Andrew Gros, Emanuele Del Fava, Jorge Cimentada, and Sofia Gil. They also include a number of external collaborators: Ilana Ventura, Francesco Rampazzo, René Flores, Ingmar Weber, Kivan Polymis, and Monica Alexander. These scholars worked on a subset of the projects that I'm presenting today. They brought a lot of creativity, enthusiasm, and energy, and I'm greatly indebted to all of them. Now, I would like to start this presentation with an image. This is a picture that shows a child in front of a distorting mirror. One of those mirrors that we see at fairs, the ones that make us look taller or shorter, wider or narrower. Now, I'm showing you this image because I believe that in a way, estimating demographic quantities is a little bit like trying to measure the size of a child when all we have are distorted images. Essentially, all data have their own imperfections. The more mirrors we have, the more we can triangulate this data and get better measurements of the underlying quantity. Now, social media, in a way, is like an additional mirror to our collection of distorted mirrors. But I would also point out during this presentation that social media can also be used to create essentially additional mirrors, as social media can be used as a source or as a tool for data collection. Now, there are different types of sources of data collection. For this presentation, I'll be focusing on the Facebook advertising platform. So Facebook has at the core of its business advertisement. So it has made it particularly easy for people to create ads. All you have to do is to go on facebook.com/business, click on create an ad, and then you will see a web interface that looks like this. So for this example, I'm choosing as targeting criteria people who live in New York, age groups 18 plus, all genders, and used to live in the UK. So based on these specifications, Facebook tells us that there are about 23,000 Facebook users who match this criteria. Now, this type of information is typically used by advertisers in order to make budgeting decisions for their campaigns, but it can also be used by demographers. Essentially, it's free of charge, and it can be accessed in a programmatic way, so in an automated way. So I think of this as a sort of mini census of the population of Facebook users, and there are similar services for other social media platforms. Now, we can also go one step further and actually create an ad. And we can use these advertisements in order to recruit survey participants. So for example, an ad like this can be shown to specific groups in the population. Those who click on the ad will be redirected to an external website that includes a survey, and people can fill out a questionnaire. Now, with this presentation, I would like to emphasize that these two functions of essentially advertising platforms, providing a mini census of the population and as a tool for data collection, are becoming more and more interdependent and complementary. And I believe that in order to advance this area of research, it will be important to sort of combine these two functions. So here is an outline for what I'm going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to discuss a framework for nowcasting migration. Then I will talk about data collection via targeted online surveys and how those can be used in order to test the validity of social media data. And finally, I'll talk about how these types of surveys can be used to reach hard-to-reach populations like migrants and also in developing countries. All right, let me start with the framework for nowcasting migration. And I'm going to start with a specific example before sort of going to the bigger picture. So I'm going to start with an example that is related to Hurricane Maria. A little over 3 years ago, in September 2017, Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico with the devastating consequences we're all aware of. Now, normally, we would look at data from the American Community Survey in order to assess the implications of the hurricane on migration and mobility in the US. However, the US Census Bureau warned scientists that that was not appropriate. This is related in part to the timing of data collection and in part to residency requirements in order to be included in the survey. So what we looked into was Facebook data, and we use a difference in difference approach. This figure shows proportional change over time of two quantities. It shows people in the US who are Puerto Ricans, that's the blue line, and people in continental US states who are non-Puerto Ricans, that are international migrants. We see that these two lines follow parallel trends up until the time when Hurricane Maria hit. Afterwards, the rate of increase of Puerto Ricans is much higher than the ones of international migrants. And so this can be used within a difference in difference approach to estimate the relative change in movements to the US. As a matter of fact, we estimated that about 180,000 people moved from Puerto Rico to continental US right after Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico. Most of them went to Florida or to states in the Northeast. And importantly, these were also validated against estimates from the US Census Bureau that use flight passenger information. And they ended up being highly consistent. One additional important aspect is that with Facebook data, we also get information like age, sex, and we can potentially follow what happens over time. So for example, we can essentially look at whether there are patterns of return migration or onward relocation. Say, let me just walk you through this figure. If we look at a state like Florida, Florida experienced a rapid increase of Puerto Ricans in the period between October 2017 and January 18. But in the early months of 2018, there was a decline in Puerto Ricans, indicating that some of them might have returned to Puerto Rico, or they might have moved to other states like Georgia or California that saw a rapid increase in Puerto Ricans. Okay, so this is an example related to sort of a specific situation and a specific disaster. Now I would like to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about the broader goal, which is to produce timely estimates of migrant stocks across, for example, all US states, but this is broader. It could be applied to other countries. So what we developed is a general framework that is, in this case, tailored to the US, but can be applied to other contexts. Here we have two data sources, the American Community Survey that gives us long-term time series by age and sex, and from which we can extract long-term patterns, but not the most recent data. And then we have Facebook data that gives us recent data, but not long-term patterns, and with some overlap with the American Community Survey. So they can be calibrated with the American Community Survey in order to tell us something about recent trends. They can be combined within a Bayesian hierarchical model that includes essentially three main components: a time series model that allows essentially for autocorrelation over time and allows for prediction, a spatial component that enables us to include spatial correlation and pooling of information, and that a data component that allows us to model different sources of error, whether it's sampling, non-sampling, bias, and so on. And so all of these can be put together in order to generate estimates and predictions of migration by age, sex, and state. Now, this is the translation of what I just said in formulas. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but if people have questions or if there are statisticians in the room, I'd be happy to address any questions you might have. Instead, I'm going to show you an example to give you a sense of what we're trying to do. This chart shows Mexican men in the US state of Georgia. We have data points like the red dots that are data from the American Community Survey. So for example, we have time series with the associated sampling error. Facebook data are the blue dots, and they give us more recent information. And finally, the black line indicates estimates from the Bayesian model. So one important thing that we observed is that a model that combines both the American Community Survey and Facebook data out of sample tends to perform better than either one that uses only DSCS or Facebook. And so this general approach that can also be applied in other contexts can be used to assess how various types of discontinuities like recessions or the current epidemic might differentially affect different demographic groups in terms of mobility and migration. Now, for all these types of analysis, understanding biases is a key component. And so far in what I've shown you, we're being sort of comparing aggregate level Facebook data with existing aggregate level estimates from surveys in order to assess biases. And this is what has been sort of developed also in the literature. What I think is coming next is that in order to understand biases, we'll use essentially frequent surveys of Facebook users that can be recruited, for example, via targeted advertisements in order to understand the biases in these users and how those change over time. So this brings me to the second main topic, which is about testing the validity of social media data via targeted surveys. And in particular, I'm going to sort of give you some examples that come from the COVID-19 Health Behavior Survey, which is a survey that was run at the Max Planck Institute over the last several months. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour to give you some background on this survey, and then I'll tell you how it can be used to assess the validity of Facebook data. So respondents were recruited via Facebook advertisements. People were shown ads. Those who clicked were redirected to a survey where we asked a number of questions, and then data were post-stratified using weights by age, sex, regions of residence in order to generate a number of estimates of behavioral change across countries and over time. Now, this survey covered 8 countries: Belgium, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, the Netherlands, the UK, and the US. And it was continuously run between March and August 2012, leading to a large sample of respondents, about 144,000. One important aspect of this survey was that it relied on targeted advertisements. Essentially, there was one advertisement campaign per country. Within the campaign, different ad sets were created for different demographic groups or different strata by sex, broad age groups, and regions of residence. And so this allowed us, by using targeted advertisements, to generate a balanced sample across different demographic groups, which within each ad set, there were different types of ads that were shown to respondents. And these include some of the type of images that we used. The response rate was fairly decent. We measured the response rate as the percentage of Facebook users who completed the questionnaire after clicking on the ad. There were some exceptions. Spain was particularly was a country where it was particularly difficult to reach users, and on average, we observed that women tended to respond more than men. In terms of post-stratification, after the data had been collected, various types of adjustments were produced in order to obtain a closer approximation to a representative sample. So, for example, for each stratum I, weights were assigned to respondents by producing a quantity that is the fraction of the proportion of individuals who belong to stratum I in the population, that's on the numerator, divided by the proportion of respondents who belong to stratum I in the survey. The reason why we did that is because we wanted to essentially inflate those demographic groups that are underrepresented in the sample and deflate those that are overrepresented. And this is a standard survey technique. Now, let me just give you an example of type of analysis before I get into testing the validity. This is an example of results from the survey, which was about estimating the average number of daily contacts that people had over time across countries and before and after physical distancing guidelines were introduced or before partial or full lockdown measures were introduced. For example, for the UK and the United States, we saw that the number of contacts that were defined as having at least a conversation of 3 words or more or physical contact were about 6 before physical distancing guidelines were introduced. They went down to about 3 before lockdown measures were introduced. They stayed at that level for the United States. They went even further down to about 2 for the UK, which introduced a lockdown measure. Now, there are lots of substantive results for this survey. Now, I can talk forever about those, but I don't want to sort of talk about these survey results specifically. I want to talk about how these types of surveys can be used for validating Facebook data. So essentially, how can we sort of assess the ability of Facebook to classify users' characteristics? Given that this survey relies on targeted advertisement, we can assess the fraction of what classifications that are correct. So for example, if we show a survey to sort of men in the age group 18-24, and then we ask them to complete the questionnaire, we can see how many report that they are men in that age group. So we see that if we pick a country like Germany, this is fairly accurate by sex and age and region, 98%, 95, 97. And so for these dimensions, Facebook correctly classifies people fairly well, with some exceptions by regions. For example, in Belgium and the United Kingdom, we still have values above 90%, but not as high as 98% in the Netherlands and so on. So if we look more closely into these regions, we see that for Belgium, for example, the lack of precision may come from one city, from Brussels, and for the United Kingdom, from London. So it turns out that the reason for misclassification for these areas is that is mostly related to people who live in adjacent regions. So for example, for the case of Brussels and Belgium, Facebook tends to classify more people as living in Brussels, whereas in the survey they reported living in adjacent regions. So essentially this tells us that for validity of classification, the Facebook advertisement platform is very, very good at the regional level, but there could be some noise at subnational, at sort of city levels, especially if there are a lot of commuters. Now, let me move to the last part, which is about social media to reach hard to reach populations, which is essentially migrants are part of these hard to reach populations. One of the next steps, that's something that is coming up, is a survey of Mexicans in the US. And this is a project in order to understand social and cultural patterns among people living in the US and their families in Mexico. And it will be run in a similar way using targeted advertisement platforms. Essentially, we don't have a sampling frame for Mexicans in the US, but we can reach them in this way. And one sort of key feature of this new form of data collection is that we will also ask people to invite members of their family via a link that is given through WhatsApp or through email, so that we will be able to assess essentially intergenerational transmission of patterns of assimilation and integration. The survey will ask a number of questions about people and their family, musical preferences, languages, views on COVID, impact of the epidemic, health, and so on. And this will also be used to assess the validity of Facebook data to go beyond age, sex, and regions, but also the extent to which, for example, Facebook correctly classifies migrants, or Facebook correctly classifies musical preference among its users. So this is something that hasn't been run yet. It will run over the next few weeks. If you are not Mexican and if you're not in the US and you see an ad from us, please let us know, because it may mean that something went wrong with our targeting criteria. But one thing that I want to point out in the last couple of minutes that I have is that this is just an example of a general trend. It's not something that we're only doing at the Max Planck Institute, for example. This is there's a broad movement in order to essentially use online samples to estimate characteristics also of the offline population. And what I'm showing here is an example of a recently published paper by Dennis Fian and Curtis Cobb, where they used Facebook surveys in order to generate estimates of internet users, essentially by asking Facebook users characteristics of non-Facebook users or people who don't use internet who are still part of their network. And using a clever network-based approach, they were able to generate essentially unbiased estimates of quantities that relate to people outside of Facebook. And so this is really promising. And so this whole area is advancing very quickly. And I think that in particular, in the context of developing countries, running frequent surveys of online users in order to say something about not only the online population, but also the offline population would be particularly important. So I started with an image. I would like to end with an image. These are pictures sent from the Hubble telescope before and after corrective optics. The Hubble telescope was launched in 1990, but there was a flaw in the main mirror. And so essentially the first pictures that were sent back to Earth looked a little bit like this one. They were kind of blurry. They were still better than the ones that could be obtained from Earth-based telescopes. And so they still led to discovery, but they were also a bit disappointing. After the flaw was corrected, images became sharper, and they led to further improvements in measurement. And so I think that to some extent, we're in a similar situation with social media data. At this point, we do have some sort of blurry images that are still useful to address a number of problems and are particularly important for developing countries. But the key is to develop corrective optics or to develop new methods in order to go from blurry images to sharper ones. And I think that we're moving in the right direction, and it's going to be an exciting area of work for the coming years. So with this, I would like to conclude and thank you all again for your attention, also on behalf of all collaborators and co-authors. And I'd be happy to take any questions or comments if we do still have a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Emilio, for this fascinating presentation. I'm sure that there will be many questions coming in the next minutes, but I would invite all of you to listen to Professor Rainer Münz immediately so we can focus our Q&A session at the end of this session. So welcome, Professor Münz. You can share your slides if you wish so.
Yes, I do. Oops. So, can you see the slides, Daniela?
Yes, it's
okay,
perfect.
Wonderful. So, good morning, everyone. I mean, good morning if you are living in a time zone where it's morning. We just had a presentation from India where it's already afternoon. Anyhow, I would like to complement what Emilio just has said by underpinning the need for better data. And let me just start by asking ourselves, as we are a forum of demographers today, what is the relevance of international migration and mobility from a demographic perspective? And I would like to start by comparing international migration to fertility and mortality. And so let's start with the incidence from a global point of view. When you look at births, you can say there is 135 million people born every year, or in this year, an estimate for 2021. And this is 11.2 per thousand. So that's the birth rate at the global level. And when we look at death, on the other hand, an estimated 65 million people will die. So I have not taken an actual burial. This is from a movie, so that nobody, can say this is inappropriate, but we have a mortality rate of 8.2 per thousand. And the gap, as we know, the difference creates annual population growth. Now, when we look at international migration, figures are less clear, but we can assume that we have somewhere between 8 and 12 million people leaving their country of residence or birth for a longer period of time and settling in another country. And so the incidence rate is about 1.3 per thousand. So this would be a mobility rate on an annual basis. So the next question is, what is the prevalence over lifetime? And here you again see a big gap between the events captured in vital statistics and international migration. Because this tells us something about the direct relevance for our lives. Now, when we go back to birth, we see that it's 100. Everybody who is here today has been born some time ago. And so this is something that affects everyone. Same with death. I hope I'm not spoiling your mood today, but we're all gonna die. Whereas when it comes to international migration, this is much less clear. So maybe we have something between 6 and 10, which means that less than 1 in 10 persons is migrating during his or her lifetime from one country to another. So the exposure, at least at global level, is much smaller. Now, when we go below the global level, we see that the estimate for lifetime exposure out of 100 people at national level is subnational level is much larger, but still less than 1 in 10. So we can say only a small minority of people ever move their main place of residence to another province. We do not have any recent data on this, but I'm hoping that the work that Emilio and his colleagues are doing will improve this. So we have data from 2005 where it was calculated that in a paper that was commissioned by UNDP and later published in 2013 in a comparison that in 2005 some 763 million people were living outside their province of birth, but still in the same country, as compared to about 200 million people at that year living outside their country of birth. So the most reliable global data is registered or assumed stocks of migrants and measured or calculated stocks in these changes. So this is the stock data that is published by the UN Population Division on a biannual basis. And we see that this stock of international migrant has been going up over the last couple of decades. And when we look back till the year 1990, we see that almost a doubling of the number of international migrants over the past 30 years. And we tend to see this as proof of an increasing likelihood or propensity of people to migrate. So by interpreting these data, a change of stocks is usually interpreted as the result of an underlying increase of migration flows across international borders. And also the way this data is presented, when I take this often quoted and taken up graph, you see that the arrows seem to suggest that there is a flow, but we have to understand that these data are strictly based on stock data, not on flow data. So they just show how many people born in a particular continent are living at a given point in time, either still in the same continent but in another country or in another continent. And so in the year 2017, we see that this is where this arrow points at, that the number of people born in Africa living in Europe was 9 million people. But it doesn't show a flow of 9 million people from Africa to Europe in a particular time span. I think it's important that the number of people living abroad, so this stock of migrants, is determined by a few elements that can easily be identified. And the most obvious one is the number of sovereign states. This is why going back beyond the year 1990 by comparing data is tricky, because with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, of former Yugoslavia, and of Czechoslovakia, the number of international sovereign states the number of sovereign states at an international level has increased by about 25 countries, which makes former internal migrants becoming international migrants, not at the time when they moved, but at the time when the country where they were living became sovereign. And it turned out that this was not their country of birth. And if you go back further, you see with decolonization, the issue is even more tricky. Then obviously, what matters is total population size at countries of origin, and then multiplied by the likelihood that people are leaving their countries of origin either on a voluntary basis or forced when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers. But then the stock is influenced by the duration of stay, which is influenced by age at time of arrival and the likelihood of return. And this is interesting because the likelihood of return describes a flow that does not increase but decrease the number of decrease the stock. And then something that we as demographers should know, but which is outside the scope of most people analyzing stock data, is that life expectancy of migrants in destination countries clearly influences the size of the stock. And this is an determining element which is often overlooked and is largely unrelated to migration, despite the fact that we know there are studies looking at life expectancies of migrants compared to natives. So we must come to the conclusion that we know much less about international migration and mobility than about birth and death and the underlying dynamics of fertility and mortality. And so I think, first of all, we need to understand that only a minority of countries provide reliable data when it comes to the inflows of migrants. But it's good to know that these countries that provide data on inflows are at the receiving end represent a majority of flows, but they are not reconciled with sending countries. So when looking at sending countries data on emigration for those countries that provide them and receiving countries data on immigration, there clearly is a gap. So when we look at countries that provide data, the OECD countries, for example, reported 8 million newly arriving immigrating non-nationals in 2018, and UNHCR for the same year reported 2.8 million newly registered refugees and asylum seekers, which together would bring us close to 13 million people registered. And then we have a few countries outside the OECD world that also provide pretty accurate data. For example, Russia in 2018 reported something just below 200,000 newly arriving non-nationals as immigrants. So the workaround we have as demographers, the first workaround is to get to global figures and to national estimates is we take the, we are estimating decennial or quinquennial flows from changes in stock data. For example, departing with the stock data published by the United Nations Population Division on a regular basis. So there's colleagues like Guy Abel, Nicola Sander, Adrian Raftery, Hanna Shevchikova, Thomas Büttner, and myself who have engaged in such kind of estimates-based converting stock data into flow data. One of the problems is that the estimates derived from quinquennial or decennial stock changes appear to be lower than the incomplete reported flow data that I have just shown to you. So this is a graph that shows the estimated number of immigrants and emigrants derived for a 5 years period derived from changes in stock data. And as you see, this has increased from 15 to 20 million per 5 years to something like 35 to 45 million in a more recent period. And this would translate, so clearly increasing. And if divided by 5, it would produce an increase from maybe something 5 to 6 million per year, some 30 years ago, to something like 7 to 9 million per year in a more recent decade. And this is below the counted numbers that I have just shown from the OECD and UNHCR figures. Now, one of the explanations could be that decennial and quinquennial figures are lower because they do not capture short-term migration periods of people staying in a particular other country for less than 5 years, something that would not have an influence on the stock. And this could be one explanation. Needs to be studied further. When we take these estimated flow data and divide them by global population, we see an interesting result, because then it appears that the likelihood of migration, so the propensity to migrate, seems to have remained fairly the same over the last 60 or 70 years, staying at around 1.2 per 1,000 per year. The workaround too that we are having is that using the residual method, which most statisticians working in population statistics are using when they don't have accurate migration data. You take just the population at a given point in time minus the population at an earlier period. You add birth and minus death, and then the result must be net migration. The problems that we are having with that kind of workaround is that all statistical errors are bundled into that and then translate into erroneous migration estimates, and relying on net migration figures heavily underestimates migration flows. One can do this not only for net migrants in general, but by also decomposing and comparing two age structures. We get an idea about the distribution of net migrants by age. Can also do this by gender. Now, at global level, net migration needs to be 0. But we encounter a similar issue that we also have with trade statistics. In trade, exports are more accurately reported than imports. In the case of migration, it's the other way around. Immigration is more accurately reported than emigration. Now, when we go down to national levels, when we look at net migration rates or absolute numbers at national level, we can be sure that beyond statistical errors, this only captures net international migration. Whereas when we go down at local level, and here we are at NUTS 3, we see that this not only captures international migration, but definitely also people moving within a country, within a province, between different premises, where you have an administrative boundary between the two. So Andre Rogers already 30 years ago wrote an article called Requiem for the Net Migrant. But when you look at published data, you see that net migrants, the concept is still quite widely used, that net migrants are quite alive, despite the fact that they don't exist as a person. Yeah. Just think for just a short moment, if we would only use natural population change to analyze total population change, which would mean that we would stop looking at birth and death separately and would just analyze and project natural population change. I think no demographer would be satisfied with such an approach, but when it comes to international migration, we're just doing that. Now, this brings us to the question, why is international migration much less well documented than vital statistics? And I think the first approach we have to see is there's an interest for long-time demographers and statisticians and states behind the calculation of the collection of these data, but also religious authorities had the main focus on birth and death. This is what defined population. And as a result, data collection has a long tradition and tools of analysis are highly developed. Just think of the way we're calculating and using life tables. And think for a moment what would happen if life tables would only be as reliable as migration matrices. One of the results would be that more often life insurance companies would go bankrupt because if the data would be as unreliable as the ones that we are producing from migration matrices. The next thing is that unlike birth and death, migration can be reversed. And this is also one of the reasons why the data that we're having are less precise or accurate. I've just tried to discuss this by comparing annual and quinquennial migration flow data. Plus, immigration is of much greater interest and therefore better documented than emigration. A fourth reason is that part of the migrant population has no interest in being statistically or administratively fully documented. Just think of irregular migrants, retired returnees, tax optimizers, or certain categories of expats. Retired returnees is an interesting question, an interesting issue, because some of these people formally keep a residence in the country where they have spent their time while working. They move back to the country of origin without deregistering because they want to keep the possibility open of moving back and forth, not least because often healthcare and health services are much easier to access and of a better quality in the country where they have worked than in their country of origin. Or expats, for example, can be exempt from paying certain taxes if they can show that they're not spending the whole year in a particular country. Which leads us to the next problem, that the main place of residence is becoming a blurred concept in times where a growing minority of people apparently live in more than one place and might also be registered in more than one place, which makes the definition, measurement, and analysis of migration a lot more difficult. Let's finish with a look into the future. When it comes to migration, most demographers make assumptions about net migration, so net gains or net losses, but not assumptions about gross inflows or outflows of migrants. So when you take the example of German projections, you see that there is one variant calculating, looking at total fertility rate, one variant looking at life expectancy beyond the basis variant, but there's no variant looking at variation of immigration or emigration, but just looking at net migration. Or when you look at more recently published projections, which were done by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and EASA, you see again that the only scenarios available are changes in net migration, but they do not give us details on the underlying assumptions about which immigration and emigration flows might be producing these changes in net migration. But it makes a huge difference if, even if net migration would be close to zero, it makes a huge difference whether there's a lot of immigration and emigration going on at the same time, or if a small amount of net migration is the result of small migration flows, and not just a small outcome at the netting. And then the question is, how do we project this into the future? And there, the interesting thing is, I'm taking world population prospects of 2010 that counterintuitively, several population projections are assuming that net migration volumes will be going down in the future. So what you see here is empirical figures, which are the bubbles, and then a gravity model, which would assume this development of immigration, of net migration to the US, or a linear model, which would look like that based on the empirical data we are having. But the UN World Population Prospect having this outcome. I had a seminar with them shortly after this was published. And you see that the World Population Prospects for 2000 in 2015 then had you see that the slope for the assumption of the decline of net migration in the future, the projection was going, was corrected. In 2000, the World Population Prospect 2010 was assuming that net migration at a global level would come to an end in the year 2100, which is just 80, 90, 79 years away from today. So the projection done after 2015 had put this 0 point at the year 2150. The Wittgenstein Center was still using the idea of decline of net migration after the year 2050. And this is not just an aberration for the US, but it's consistent when we look at other classical immigration countries like Canada and Australia, where conventional wisdom would suggest that the end of immigration and the end of gains from net migration in these countries is quite an unlikely scenario for the future. But it's a scenario in which major population projections used by demographers are based on. So let me finish by saying policymakers are not interested in net migration. They are interested in immigration flows and to a certain degree also in emigration flows, but in particular in gross immigration. Some, not all policymakers are looking for empirical information and are interested in understanding drivers, causes, and consequences of migration. And for this, we need gross flows. Unfortunately, when dealing with policymakers, the unfortunate thing is that information on asylum requests and detected irregular border crossings are the only data that are available almost in real time, whereas data on first residence permits issued for family reunion or for work usually come with a time lag of 12 to 18 months. So the attention of policymakers is much more on asylum requests and on irregular border crossings than on other migration flows, because so there I put great hopes on the work that Emilio and his colleagues are doing, and which Emilio has just shown to get to come to real-time data when it comes to other migration flows as well. Empirical data could inform about the success or failure of certain measures if they were available, not on a net basis, but as gross flows and in a more timely manner. And interpreting international migration just as a reaction to perceived deficits, which is apparently the underlying concept for population projections, assuming that net migration will disappear in the future, is not necessarily helpful in my view. For that reason, it might be useful not to assume the decline of international migration in our forecasts. So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give me to present my work, but also my considerations on the work of my colleagues. And I'm happy to take questions if we still have some time. Over to you, Daniela.
Thank you so much for this nice presentation. We are now open the Q&A session. If you have questions, please write it down in the Q&A box in the bottom of the screen. But meanwhile, we got 3 questions. So the first 2 ones are to Emilio. So Emilio, the first one says, how do you deal with the fact that more and more young people are using other social media tools like Instagram than Facebook? Will your method of collecting data also work? What ways do you see to react to this trend? And the second question also to you refers to what extent do you think it's feasible to arrange Facebook servers in large population country like India?
Okay, thank you, Daniela, and thank you to the people who asked the questions, which are certainly relevant. One thing that I would like to point out is that I presented examples with Facebook, but it's a more so general approach. And so it's all these social media platforms have advertising platforms. So advertising is at the core of their business. So whether you're interested in sort of WeChat and people in China, or whether you're interested in Facebook and people in the Western world, or other types of social media, Twitter has its own advertising platform, Instagram is part of Facebook. So essentially, you can reach different people in that way. And what I was presenting was that there are 2 different types of situations. So one is the situation of, say, European countries where we do have some migration data, and there are sort of like statistical techniques that can be used to sort of essentially enhance this data and remove their imperfections. And then there's like other countries where we don't have data at all. And so I was sort of presenting this idea of combining essentially passively collected information from social media with sort of surveys that tells us something about the biases in these social media in order to sort of measure migration on a more timely manner. And the key aspect is also to understand the biases, which will be different for different platforms. But once we develop methods, they can be applied to different platforms. One other things to consider is that some of these users might use different platforms, and so we can always consider analysis that incorporate different sources. Like I wouldn't sort of think of Facebook versus Twitter versus Instagram and so on. They all sort of represent different portions of the populations. And so once we understand the biases, we can sort of combine them. And this is something for which there is some tradition in demographic work, where people sort of in the past looked at different newspapers and sort of reports in different newspapers to assess deaths in conflicts, for example. And so there are some methods that have been developed in order to sort of have different, include multiple sources into one, in order to generate one estimate. India, for example, that's a country where there was a survey that was not specifically targeting migrants, but it was run by Nadia Diamond Smith, who is a professor at UCSF in San Francisco. And it was done using the Facebook advertisement platform. So essentially, it would work in a similar way. Maybe just like one thing that I also wanted to say is that this doesn't have to be limited to sort of social media platforms. Also, like mobile phones are so widespread that like surveys run via SMS, for example, or reaching people in other ways via WhatsApp, for example, that those could be additional opportunities. And these are particularly important, or maybe I should clarify that what I showed you were examples that focused on essentially rich countries, Europe and North America, because I think that the first step is to make sure that we can sort of test the methods where we have data, where we can calibrate ground truth. But the real potential is for developing countries. Once we can get something that works well, where we can test it with ground truth, we can also go into the unknown, that is sort of low and middle income countries. And there, like ideally, one sort of way to think about it is that some existing surveys like DHS would include questions about migration that would sort of improve our ability to sort of measure migration in that context. But if not, perhaps some sort of like mini DHS that is run via online surveys that are sort of validated and sort of assessed for consistency could tell us something. And the fact that they may be run at different time intervals and sort of more frequently, they may also enable us to capture different types of migration or different types of mobility that are happening, including seasonal patterns and new forms of relocations that we wouldn't be able to capture with sort of like one survey run every 5 years or every 4 years and so on.
Thank you so much. We have now a question for Heine Münz. So this is Hidi Kashyap from the University of Oxford. She's asking, to what extent is the inconsistency between stocks and flow data a result of an increasing complexity in migration trajectories? For example, more short-term migration, circular migration. Is this complexity increasing or not? How do you advise modifying migration data collection strategies to be changed to capture some of these changes? So what would be your suggestions?
Thank you very much for this question. Yeah, I think we have to understand that the concept of migration assumes that you have a main place of residence. And when you change this main place of residence, you become a migrant, according to the UN definition, if this change takes place for more than 12 months. But we also, I mean, the European Union member states are issuing work permits also for shorter period. And so we could also have seasonal migration, for example. But when you go back to what Emilio has just said, working on the basis of cell phones, the identifying the location of people is totally different from this idea of having a main residence, because the main residence is defined by, for example, where you are taxed or where you have voting rights and things like that. But I think particularly the relocation of people pertaining to home office during COVID times shows that the place where you are registered and the place where you're actually sitting can be different. And we have not reconciled this, because one way of working this, and would be happy to discuss this with Emilio and others, is if you have seasonal migrants moving between two places, maybe one would go back to a concept where a person in demography would not count as one, but only a 0.5. Yeah, which would be more appropriate. So if somebody is a ski trainer in the winter and does training of windsurfing in the summer, something that this winter did not work in most places of Europe, who spends part of the year here and part of the year there, is this an international migrant? The statistics would look, when you would base statistics on cell phones or Facebook use, or where you log in yourself, would be looking different in the winter than in the summer. Same with people who have a secondary residence in one country and a main residence in another, but the less they spend time at the workplace, maybe the more time they spend at the secondary residence. And then the question is, when is a person becoming an international migrant who has these two residences? And I could go on with that kind of examples. Still, at the global level, this is a minority of people having that. But the further we get into the rich world and the further we get down below national levels, and when we look at provincial or county levels, the more this becomes a problem, that our assumption that the person has one main place of residence, and if this place is changed, the person only then becomes a migrant or a mobile citizen, is something that needs to be reconsidered. Yeah, so the concept of migration is somehow undermined by the reality of life in that respect. But just like the Tesla company knows exactly where its cars are, we could also track people who have cell phones and then calculate it after the fact how many days they have spent at a particular place, and then define whether they to which place they should be assigned properly. Yeah, so that's a workaround. But yes, this creates these differences.
Thank you so much. We have Michael Herman from your UNFPA. You would like to speak, Michael?
Yes, thank you very much, Daniela, and I am conscious of the time, so just a quick question, really. Firstly, thanks to two excellent presentations, I think, that also remind us of how difficult it is to estimate migration flows in this COVID time, where we're trying to understand return migration, for example. But to my question, now we've looked at, Emilio, you presented the use of Facebook data to some extent to estimate migration flows. Rainer, you just mentioned the possible use of cell phone data, and in UNFPA we have used cell phone data to track migration flows. If you compare these different methods that we have out there, and maybe there are many, many more, okay, would you say there is a state of the art that we can use for different countries to estimate migration flows? Should we use cell phone data? Should we use Facebook data? Should we use something else if you compare the different methods? Over.
Should I?
Please go ahead, Emilio.
So thank you, Michael. That's a very good question. My sense is that we should use all available data, and it depends on the context. So, for example, in the European context, we have lots of data from population registers and from other sources that sort of national statistical offices organize. That can be complemented by labor force surveys, for example, in the context where there are some holes. And still, we don't have, so we can get like long-term pictures from combining those data in a proper statistical with a proper statistical approach, but we don't get the most recent data. So if we want to know something about the impact of COVID-19 on migration, we wouldn't be able to get those, in part because of the way they are sort of collected and the definition that people have to sort of live for 12 months in a country. So there are delays in production. So in that context, I think of sort of data like Facebook data or additional sources from cell phone data and so on as the equivalent of so the provisional GDP estimate. So like economists always produce some estimate that is a provisional estimate of GDP that then is going to be revised when better data are available. And so to a first approximation, that type of data can be used in this context, like where we don't really have anything else, we can sort of make sure that they are as consistent as possible with what we know from other sources. And there will still be some uncertainty or quite a bit of uncertainty depending on the country. So less uncertainty in Europe. If we go to a country like Lebanon, where we don't know anything, there would still be a lot of uncertainty, but it may still tell us something, if not about the level, at least about the trends. And then like, as we sort of wait a little bit and sort of other data come in, we can triangulate them even further, and then we'll sort of have a revised estimate of past trends. That would be sort of like the way I would think of this data.
Yeah, if I may just add to what Emilio has said. Emilio, if you go to Lebanon, then you would probably start looking at UNHCR data and see how many people have registered with UNHCR. Because as we know, the state of Lebanon is not registering Syrian refugees because they don't want them on their territory. Yeah? But still, so aid would be a measure. You can never be sure. I remember a survey done in a large refugee camp of supposedly Somalian refugees in Kenya, in an area where there were also ethnic Somalis living at the same place. And then it turned out that only 80% of the people living in the camp were actually ethnic Somalis from Somalia, and about 20% of the camp population were Kenyans of ethnic Somali descent who found life easier in the camp than outside, because people in the camp were provided with food and shelter. And so also, I mean, UNHCR data can be misleading. I'm just saying there's gap. Now, let me go back to the question of Herman and Michael Herman and the use of cell phones. The interesting thing about cell phones is not just to look about the movement of people, so where you see where the cell phone got logged in, but also to see what kind of calls were made. And some of my colleagues at the Joint Research Center in ISPRA were looking at cell phone connections to see how many people have been making calls to non-EU and non-European countries in order to estimate a certain population of certain origins, assuming that people making calls to Nigeria from Italy are most likely of Nigerian origin themselves, or people making a phone call to Syria might be from Syria themselves. And so it could also underpin the origins of people, even if we have no clue who the owner of the cell phone is. And I think it's just like Emilio has said, if you want to make a rough estimate provisionally, instead of waiting 12 to 18 months before you get final data, such data can really fill the gap and make sure that we are not just looking at the data that are readily available on an administrative basis, which always creates a bias towards asylum and irregular border crossing.
Okay, thank you so much. I see more hands raised. Unfortunately, we are already 15 minutes after our time slot, so I apologize for those who could not share their questions. And we will now have a 15-minute break, and I invite you to join our meeting to continue participating. At 11, we'll have a session on family and fertility.